I know that you are mostly a space crowd, so I guess you're all familiar with the different plans for sending humans to Mars or the Moon in the coming decades from different space agencies and also private companies. And I guess some of you are also very familiar with some of the technologies which are developed or improved to make it possible, like new propulsion systems, improved habitats, ways of protecting humans from radiation, life support systems, which is what I'm normally working on, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. Because today I want to speak about a different piece of equipment, which is arguably the most unpredictable component ever sent to space: humans. And one might say that we know humans quite well because we are interacting with them on a daily basis. Maybe not now that you're doing a PhD, but like remember the years before. But the thing is that humans in a normal setting, like a winter school at Le Tech, behave quite differently from humans which are isolated, in tight quarters, in close proximity with always the same people, under a high workload in an extreme environment, a high pressure, and all the things that people will be exposed to when they are living, for instance, in the future moon village or long-term missions to be on Earth in general. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So we don't want predictability, of course, is not a very good thing for space missions. So we want to be able to predict as much as possible how humans will behave there. And it's very difficult to make predictive models of human behavior. If you have a friend who's an economist, you can ask them. And the best way to study that is to look at similar situations. Unfortunately, we don't have a previous moon village or a previous Mars mission to observe and to draw lessons from. But we have some environments which are analogs of that. We have the space station, which might be the most obvious, but we also have expeditions to the poles. We have bases in Antarctica and in the Arctic. We have submarines, and we have also some bases which are built to be analogous to Moon or Mars bases. Okay, of course, none of them has all the interesting features of a planetary base, but by combining them, we can actually learn some useful things for predicting human behavior. And I like to speak from personal experience, so I'm going to illustrate some of the things I'm going to tell you today based with anecdotes of some of the missions that I took part in. So I'm going to start by introducing those two missions. Okay, the first one is the mission HISIS-4, which was a mission which is funded by NASA and managed by the University of Hawaii. And the purpose there was to recreate the living conditions of a base on Mars to study primarily human factors. Okay, we studied also a few different things, like some technologies which are developed for such missions, but the main goal was to study the human factors. And it took place on the slope of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii, which is a bit similar to Mars. As you can maybe see here, I don't know if the lighting is good, but you have a volcanic rock with different shades of red and black, huge volcanoes, and basically no visible trace of civilization besides the small base. And so we were 6 people living in this dome here, which was about 11 meters in diameter. And we were trying to live in conditions which are as close as possible as a mission to Mars. For instance, we never went outside without a spacesuit analog, which means that for 1 year we were never exposed directly to sunlight or to fresh air. We had no direct communication, so no phone, no internet, which means no Facebook, WhatsApp, Skype, or whatever you're using. We had only a communication system which is based on emails, but has a 40-minute delay in both directions. A 20-minute delay in both directions, which means that if you're sending a message, you know that you will never have an answer in less than 40 minutes. So for 1 year, we never talked to or saw anybody else outside the 6 of us. That's how it looked inside. Okay, so it's the diameter was actually quite small. So it's 11 meters, but since it's a dome, it's quite spacious. You have an impression of space. There is a big volume, and it's a bit like being in a hemispheric movie theater. Okay, but it's all white, so it gets boring after some time. And the thing we were doing there was research. Okay, we all had our own research projects because we're all engineers or scientists or something approaching. And we took advantage of the infrastructure for our own experiments. But our main job there was to be test subjects. So we were studied by different teams of scientists, which were, for instance, giving us surveys to fill in. We had about maybe a dozen surveys every day with questions about what we had done during the day, how we had slept, about our mood, about our interactions, and a lot of different aspects of our life there. We also had sensors. We had sensors around our wrists, around our chests, around our necks, which were documenting our sleep, our physical activity, our heart rate, and even our interactions. We had those badges, so the little boxes here, which are called sociometric badges. We were able to know how close we were physically from each other, who was interacting with whom, how often, how body was reacting to those interactions, for instance, by correlating it to heart rate, and so on. And finally, there were some cameras. You can see one here in some aspects, in some parts of the dome, which were constantly filming. But funnily enough, it is actually those badges that made us feel self-conscious at times. We had a lot of different, let's say, a lot of different tests. For instance, tasks which were made for assessing our level of cooperation throughout the mission. We were giving also biological samples of urine, of saliva, of hair. It's actually quite funny. We all had this square at the back of our head where hair samples were taken regularly. And that was to document our, basically to measure some hormones, and like this to document our stress either through time or after some specific tasks. We also had some tasks to perform outside in spacesuit analogs. For instance, some cooperative tasks to see how our cooperation was changing through time, some research projects to assess our ability to perform complex tasks, some exploratory missions, for instance, mapping the inside of a lava tube, and so on. There are a lot of different things, but I don't want to speak about it too much. But yeah, basically the point is everything we're doing during the day or even during the night was interesting to at least one team of researchers. So that was the HICIS-4 mission. And the second mission I will talk about is a winter over at Concordia Station in Antarctica. So that's Concordia. It's a base which is about 1,000 kilometers inland, and it's one of the only 3 bases in Antarctica which is, well, inside the continent, open during the whole year. It's managed jointly by France and Italy, which already makes it a bit special, not because it is France and Italy, but because it's the only permanent base in Antarctica which is managed jointly by 2 different countries, okay, with all the advantages and difficulties that it implies. And it's a place which is extreme in different ways. The most obvious one is that it is quite cold. Okay, that's, for instance, what happens when you throw boiling water in the air. The temperatures in winter can go down to below minus 80 degrees Celsius. So it's quite cold. It's also very isolated. Okay, in summer, you can have up to 80 people in the base. People can come and go. There are planes which are connecting Concordia to the coast. But then, from early February, everybody leaves except a dozen people. We were 13 last year. And those spend what is called the winter over. They winter over there. It lasts for 9 months. And during those 9 months, it's so cold that planes cannot come anymore. So whatever happens, the crew knows that they will not evacuate the base. That they will not evacuate the base, and that nobody will come to rescue them. Another challenge is the fact that there is little oxygen. First, because it's at 3.2 kilometers of altitude, and also because the atmosphere is thinner at the poles. So you have a bit more than 60% of the oxygen level that we have here, which is equivalent to being between 3.7 and 4 kilometers of altitude in the Alps. And over months and months, it has different impacts on sleep, on your cognitive skills, your physical abilities, of course, and your health in general. Then the air is extremely dry. It's actually the driest desert on Earth, which creates different kinds of inconveniences. And you have a strange light cycle. Okay, in summer, for most of summer, you have daylight 24 hours a day. Okay, this could have been taken during the night. And afterwards, like during the winter, it's night most of the time, including 3 months in which the sun does not rise above the horizon. Like this photo, for instance, was taken in the afternoon. And what was the reason why we are sending people there in spite of the challenges is that it's a very, very good place for different kinds of research. For astronomy, for instance, because you have a very thin atmosphere, which is also very dry, so you can see through it very nicely. And since you have long periods of night, you can actually monitor some objects in the sky for continuously, 24 hours a day. Since it's in a place which has very little pollution, vibrations, mostly you have no background vibrations, very good also for seismology studies. It's very good for studies on magnetism, on many fields, because well, you have a lot of observatories in the northern hemisphere, but you have very little in the south because of the oceans and the fact that some continents, like here, are difficult to reach. So the magnetic observatory in Concordia is very important. And since it's there is very, very little pollution, it's very good for atmospheric studies and studies on ice and snow, okay, glaciology. And actually one of my roles there was that of a glaciologist, the other one being a station leader. So that's one, let's say, category of research that is performed at Concordia. But as you might have understood from the description of the base, it's also considered as the closest analog we have on Earth to a base on a future base on the Moon or Mars. And this has not gone unnoticed by space agencies, and notably the European space agencies, which is sending every year a medical doctor to basically study how we adapt to this environment. So there has been some studies on sleep, not last year, but some of the years before. There are studies on our immune system, how it evolved in this environment where it sees almost nothing new. Studies on how we adapt to hypoxia. Studies on our microbiome changes, our inner microbiome. Studies of our cognitive abilities, memory, motor skills, and so our abilities to perform tasks, complex tasks, such as, for instance, docking a Soyuz to a space station. So we're all trained to dock a Soyuz on this simulator. And then at different frequencies, we were then performing this docking, and our performance was recorded so that we can see whether it improved, whether it went worse, or whether we just crashed the Soyuz after some time. And that's mostly because if you teach people complex maneuvers, you want to be sure that after, let's say, a trip to Mars, they are still able to perform those complex tasks after spending months in sensory deprivation, in a very monotonous environment, being tired, maybe having a lower oxygen level based on the mission settings and so on. So that is the second mission I'm going to refer to, and now I'm going to tell you about some of the lessons we learned from studying humans in this kind of environment. Of course, I will not give you an exhaustive list of everything, but the idea is to give you an overview so that you have a better understanding of why and how we study humans in this kind of environments to prepare for future missions beyond Earth. Now also, I want to point out also that although I'm going to use anecdotes from those missions to illustrate some of those lessons, the lessons are not drawn only and not even mainly from those experiments. Okay, they are lessons which comes from years of exploration. One of the most important domains in which we are learning from life in extreme environments is group interactions, which, as you probably can guess, are critical in isolated and confined environments. Okay, imagine, for instance, that you've been selected for a mission to Mars. Launch day is maybe the most exciting day of your life. You leave Earth, you have a beautiful view of your planet from the window, you have a lot of exciting things to do. Your crewmates are the best people in the world and so on. But then as time goes by, the view through the window becomes not boring, but you have seen it already and you get used to it. The tasks that you have to do become monotonous. The people around you, you know all the anecdotes, all the jokes. You know, you don't really get any new input from them, and you cannot really get away from them. You know, they're 24 hours a day, you always hear them, they're always next to you, and maybe they're getting a bit on your nerves. Okay? And you know that you still have months or even years to spend with them in this kind of environment. And that can be a problem if there is no countermeasure, right? And it's even worse because with time, the isolation and the confinement have some, let's say, strange impacts on people's psychology, which can exacerbate those kind of issues. Okay, one thing, for instance, which is quite common is what is called macro-stimuli. Okay, little things that people do that normally would not bother you, or that you would maybe not even notice, like, I don't know, the way that somebody fidgets, you know, with a pen, or the fact that they are chewing loudly, or some, you know, they use maybe the word literally inappropriately all the time. This kind of thing. And normally it's not a big problem, but if you're exposed to this constantly for months, it can actually become a huge concern. Again, sometimes when you hear about fights that happen in Antarctic stations, for instance, you are surprised by how little created that. You're like, why do people like get mad for that? It's nothing if you see it from like your normal eyes when you are in a normal situation. And then there are things which are not exactly micro-stimuli, which are little problems, but which normally are okay. Like somebody maybe is stressed one day and talks to you in the way which is not the most respectful. Normally maybe you'd just be, okay, well, that's fine, I'm going to come back later. But in this kind of environment, it can become a huge issue for different reasons. And imagine also that one person has this kind of interaction with somebody else. Like let's say person A has this interaction with person B, and they tell person C about that. And person C also didn't really like person B, you know, they don't really know why, but they will tell each other the stories and start amplifying their own, like reciprocally their feelings about that person. And after some time of going like this in a closed circuit with that new input, they can start hating person B, even though that person did not really do anything wrong. If it's a person alone, that person can be completely isolated from the crew. It actually happens regularly in this kind of environment. And if it's like a group and another group, then you can have actually two subgroups which will sometimes not interact properly together, or at worst start fighting each other. Okay, and sometimes it happens within the crew, and that's very bad for, of course, for the proceedings of the mission. Sometimes it happens between the crew and the people on the ground. Okay, and it's actually a very common phenomenon. It's called crew-ground disconnect, when people from the crew start thinking, oh, you know, like they're not answering our emails very quickly, they don't care about us. And then, you know, they start talking, and at the end it's like, okay, they are the enemy. And it's quite, and actually an interesting thing is that sometimes people on the ground, when they feel like the crew is maybe a bit, you know, there might be some tension, they say, okay, like, put the blame on us. Because like this, the crew will team against the ground control rather than between each other. Of course, it's not ideal because you want, like, if you're on the ground, you want your crew to still obey what you are telling them, but it's still better than conflicts within the crew. Yeah, ideally, you would avoid both. So anyway, the point is that there are many other like interesting dynamics that, on a social level that can be going on. But the main point is that it can be it can be a very, very big concern, because crew cohesion is critical to the most important mission objectives, and one of them includes survival. So we need to, because if there is an emergency, you want people to be able to react very quickly, and if the crew is not cohesive, then it might be what makes a difference between the crew surviving and the crew dying. Most of the stories were of the early expeditions to the poles where people died are usually crews which were not cohesive. And there are some crews which are very cohesive and that survived in situations where basically everybody would have said that they would die. Okay, so crew cohesion is important for both reaching the objectives and for the crew to survive. Now, one of the ways of studying those interactions and finding ways of improving them is mostly by observation and experimentation in analog environments. I'm going to give you a few examples of things that were learned from those environments that can be useful for improving group interactions. One important strategy is to select not only individuals, but to select a group. Okay, because let's say historically, it's been very common that to think, okay, I want to have the best crew possible, so I'm going to take the best cooks, the best physicists, the best astrobiologists, and so on, then put them together, and there will be a very good crew. But that's actually usually not a good idea, because you can take the best people individually, and together they will not be cohesive and they will not be able to work properly. Okay, not because they are not social people, not because they don't have the abilities to behave properly in a crew, but just because some people together will not fit. Okay, I guess you all have like personal examples of this kind of situation. And so one way to deal with this problem is to select people as a group. Of course, you cannot only do that. You cannot just take random people and put them together and then see how they behave. You need some part of selection, person by person selection. But at some point in the selection process, you should start putting people together. Now, there are different moments in the selection process where you can do that, and I'm going to give you a few examples. The first one is a mission which was called Mars Arctic 365. Okay, which was where the crew which was selected was supposed to spend 1 year in a Mars analog base in the Arctic. And the mission was cancelled eventually because of lack of funding, but the selection process has been going on for 2 years before that. It started 6 years ago. And in the beginning, people were, for most of those 2 years, people were passing tests individually. So you had a few hundred of candidates, and then say, okay, now you have to do this, do that, take write an essay, and so on. But then, for one of the last steps of the selection process, they took the people that remained, it was about 20 people, split them into 3 groups, mostly based on, they tried to do it based on skill complementarity, but it was also based on people availability, simply, when people were able to do it. They had the 3 groups, and the 3 groups spent 2 weeks each at a small Mars analog base in the desert of Utah. MDRS, for maybe you heard of it, and that was then to select the best crew. Okay, that's not what happened in the end, but that was what was planned. So that's one way of doing. Another example is for the HICIS-4 mission that I mentioned before. For this one, people were mostly selected individually, and then for the final step of the selection, they took 8 people, and they wanted a crew of 6 in the end. They brought us to at the entrance of a national park in Wyoming with some tents, food, products to purify water, maps, and then say, okay, you have 5 days to go to this point on the map. And during those 5 days, we had to walk together, cook together, and more generally spend time together in close quarters. And then in the end of this week, they basically got feedback from the crew, and they took out 2 people, which were not necessarily the 2 people which were worst as individuals, but 2 people that fit the list in the crew. Now, a third example is what happened for Concordia. So for this one, it was a bit complicated because there are, as I said, 2 countries involved. There is on the Italian side the PNRA, which is the Italian Institute for Research in Antarctica. And there is IPEV, which is a French Polar Institute, and both of them initially recruited people separately. Okay. For the Italian side, which was the side for which I was working, part of the selection was individual, so we had lots of psychological screening, medical tests, and so on. But then after that, they took all the people that they had pre-selected for 1 week of training, where they had theoretical training, but also a lot of different tests. For instance, here, you have our, it was then our future medical doctor was crossing a tunnel in flames. We had lots of tests like that, like rescue in water, emergency and first aid training, climbing, and lots of things like this, where we had to work together, and we were constantly observed by a psychologist. Okay, for the whole week, which was then able to see, see how people were fitting together. And then after that, we spent a few days camping on a glacier next to the Mont Blanc. So we basically set up our tents, built walls around it, and then had a normal life camp, so taking turns for cooking and so on. And that was to put us in a situation which could be uncomfortable, and where people would be in very close proximity, and like this, take out some people that didn't really fit with the rest of the group. Okay, and then after that, the people selected by the Italian side and the people selected by the French side were put together for a week, where we had further training and team building activities. And there were psychologists as well. And even though at this point, normally the people making it that far, where the people would be the crew, it would still have been possible to detect some important issues and take out some people. Okay, so you have different ways. These are different stages at which you can start selecting people as a group. But it will be very important that people going on a long-term mission to, let's say, the Moon or Mars, spend some time together in an isolated and confined environment, so that you can detect problems while it's still time to take people out. Okay, now another way of, let's say, avoiding group interaction issues is to train people, of course, to teach them first cultural awareness. Because some of the most successful expeditions, exploratory missions, were with a very homogeneous crews. Okay, which had some drawbacks, but also made things easier for group interactions. But this will probably not be the case for future missions to the Moon or Mars, because there will be different countries involved, like on the ISS. We'll need a wide range of skill sets, and you want to represent like wide range of humanity. But the drawback of that is that you can have cultural issues, because in different cultures, of course, some ways of behaving can be interpreted in different ways. And a very simple example is that for HICIS-4, we were 2 Europeans and 4 Americans. And before the mission started, we told them, okay, if you feel like we upset at you, if you feel like we don't like you, just ask us for confirmation. It might be just a misunderstanding, because the average people where we're coming from is a bit maybe less expensive than the average American. I think that's avoided some misunderstandings then during the mission. It was also the case in Concordia, of course, because you had Italians and French, and so we had to discuss basically before the mission what could be misinterpreted by a French from an Italian, and conversely. Then another important point is to discuss the issues that people should expect. Okay, people should be aware that they will be affected by the conditions, and people tend to underestimate that. They're like, oh, okay, now maybe people get crazy, but I will be fine, you know. And when you're actually in a good shape and you are in a comfortable environment, it's very difficult to project yourself and imagine how you might think when you will be isolated for months. And so it's important to convince people that they will be affected psychologically. And like this, when during the mission, it made them to pause and think, okay, well, it did not clean his dishes right after dinner, but like, is it a legitimate reason to kill him, or maybe I'm overreacting? Yeah. So it's important to be aware and to know what to expect. Then another thing to teach is protocols to solve conflicts. And by this, I don't mean just like training people to solve conflict, but also have a commonly agreed, common procedure that everybody agrees on. Because once you have an issue during the mission, it's much easier to say, okay, let's follow procedure ABC because we're having some issues, and then everybody sits and knows what to do. It's much easier than be like, okay, let's like sit together in a room and have an awkward conversation. It's much easier to have a commonly agreed strategies and to know what to do. And another thing that works well is to discuss before the mission starts what could go wrong in the crew. During the final step of the selection for HICIS-4, we sat together and we had a list of points to discuss. It could be things like, okay, what could annoy you from the other crew members? Like somebody could say, okay, I hate when people leave their dirty socks on the ground, or I hate when people don't clean their dishes right after dinner, or I don't like when people use the word literally inappropriately, things like that. Like this, the other people knew that they should avoid to these kind of things. Another kind of thing that we discussed was, what should you do if I do that? For instance, if I start isolating myself, if I lock myself in the room, for how long should you consider that it's a healthy coping mechanism, that I need some privacy? And when should you consider that I'm actually isolating myself? And what should we do if you do that? Should we go and drag you out of bed? Should we try to attract you with food? Should we just like leave you alone because it's dangerous to enter? And like this, when the situation arose, there was no misunderstanding. The thing we talked about is our rules, okay? Because there are rules, of course, which are dictated by the institutes you're working for. Okay, for instance, don't go outside without a suit if you're in Antarctica because you will die. But there are also some rules which are not dictated by the institute, but which are also important. For instance, what do we do if two people are very attracted to each other? Do we allow couples to form, and under which conditions? Okay. And then we also discussed about what do we do if I don't know, somebody has knows that as a close relative who died and wants to leave the mission. Okay, in Concordia, of course, was not possible, but during HACIS 4, what do we do? Do we allow that person to leave? How do we support it, and so on? And I think discussing all this beforehand was very helpful and avoided some potential issues that could have happened during the year. And we did something similar also for Concordia afterwards. Another thing that might seem obvious is to build cohesion. And that should start before the mission. If you select people as a group and if you train them together before mission, as you should, hopefully they will arrive on site, on the side of the mission as a team already. And a way to, let's say, improve that is try to build a crew identity. Okay, a simple example, before ICES and Concordia, we designed our mission patches before the mission started. We made stickers, t-shirts out of it, and that actually helped to build a crew identity. And like this, after when we arrived there, we didn't feel like we were two people just, who were going to live at the same place and work at the same place, but we were a crew. In missions like HACIS 4, where people would be working together extensively, that was maybe not absolutely necessary, but in a place like Concordia, where people have very different jobs, some are technicians, some are scientists, some are Italian, some are French, everybody is here for different reasons, then it's very important to, when you don't have just a common objective that everybody will gather behind, it's important to build a crew identity. And then cohesion, of course, should be maintained during the mission by doing group activities. Okay, the most simple one is to have celebrations, celebrating important milestones of the mission, celebrating holidays, celebrating the anniversary of the first person in space, these kind of things. Also having group projects. In Concordia, for instance, we built a climbing wall in a room. And also like very little simple things like that. Okay, that is actually a prank that we pulled on the mission support during HACIS 4. We sent them this photo and pretended that one of the crew members was pregnant. Yeah. Of course, we told them afterward that was a prank, but for the anecdote, the photo somehow leaked on social media. And my mother almost had a car accident when a friend of hers called her on the phone and congratulated her on being a grandmother. But anyway, what I mean is like little things like that, little group projects, little pranks that you're doing together, are actually very important for maintaining a cohesive crew. And another important thing is to have the expedition leader trained to manage conflicts. Okay, of course, ideally everybody should be able to do that. Everybody should be able to mediate. But I think it's very important that a special leader especially can do that, because first they will be in a good position to detect problems, because I would be always like screening people for issues, always being on the lookout for problems in the base, and people will report to them. Okay. Also, okay, we have this problem either because they want you to do something about it, or sometimes because they just need to vent out. Then another reason is that you will actually have the expedition leader will actually have the authority to come and say, okay, now we need to sit together and work on this problem. Speaking of the expedition leader, leadership is another aspect from which we're learning very important lessons from humans in extreme environments on Earth. One might say that we can just look at CEOs, military officers, politicians, and so on, because they have been confronted to leadership issues. But the thing is, people in those environments have methods which do not apply in isolated and confined environments. Okay, one of the reasons for that is that people that you will be leading in isolated and confined environments typically have very peculiar personalities. Typically, they will be very good in their domain, in their field. They will be very autonomous. They will have a very strong will. Often, they will be leaders themselves. So they are not the most, the easiest crowd to manage. And the peculiarities will be exacerbated by the living conditions. They can become stressed, anxious, depressed, tired, and so on. And sometimes behave in a way which would seem a bit strange if they were happening in a normal setting. And to face those challenges, you don't have the tools that leaders normally have. Okay, you don't have, for instance, support for you. You don't have much support from your hierarchy. You cannot, if one of your subordinates refuses to obey, you cannot, call your own manager and say, hey, this guy did that. Can you talk to them? Because you own the people above you in the hierarchy are not on site and they have no way to come. Okay, so leadership in this kind of environment is usually a very lonely job. Then you have little ways of enforcing discipline. Okay, because you cannot fire people. Okay, they would, because they will be around anyway. You cannot really you cannot really remove privileges because they have already very little privileges, and the few that remain are very important for their mental health. You cannot call the police in the most extreme cases because, depending on the time of year, they might not be able to do anything before months. And actually, I was told during my training that I had a plastic gun, in the sense that I could threaten people, but if I had to fire, if I had to shoot, people would notice that nothing happens, and I would lose credibility and authority. Okay, so you cannot rely just on your title to expect people to follow you. That might work for some time. People in the beginning might obey you just because you're the boss, but as time goes by, you actually need to have them follow you and convince that following you is the best thing for them. Okay. Another tool that you don't have is a psychological distance. You probably have some examples of people leaders who tend to be aware from the team. Maybe they have an office in a different place. They interact in a very formal way. They tend to basically fly above their crew, or their team. It's particularly obvious in the military when you have officers which are not allowed to make strong bonds with their subordinates. But it's also the case in very different settings. You have the very formal lab leader as a CEO, which behaves in a very formal way and so on. And that is good for remaining neutral, okay? Because if you're not involved personally with people, it's much easier to take objective decisions. It's also very useful for some people to keep authority, because if you're a bit unfamiliar and so on, can be a bit intimidating. And as many leaders actually rely on that, on the fact that they're not familiar with people and that they can have some authority because of that. But that obviously will not work in isolated and confined environments, simply because people see you 24 hours a day, every day, and they see you in all kinds of situations. So you cannot really, be the leader in his golden tower and over your crew. So leadership in this environment is a bit different from leadership in a normal setting. And what we are learning in this field actually mostly comes from observation of previous missions. Some of the things that we have seen to be working is to have a democratic style of leadership, which means talking to people before a decision, talking to people who will be affected by the decision, talking to people who will have skills that are important for the decision. Okay, if you want to change the hydraulic system, for instance, you will talk to the plumber, obviously, and that is both because it will allow you to make the best decisions, but also it will allow you to have people support this decision. Because as we saw before, you cannot just expect people to obey you because you are the boss. You cannot expect you to just order and people will follow. You have to convince them to follow you, because otherwise they will just stop doing it over the long term. Another aspect is to behave in a way which is consistent with the psychological distance we have with your crew. As I said, you will become a very familiar figure. And so you should not try to be the distant leader, but you should on the other, or at least that's what the most successful leaders in Antarctic bases are doing. They are crew members before being leaders. You will see them taking part in group activities. You will see them clean the dishes and wipe the ground like everybody else. And speaking of credibility, an important thing also when you select a leader is to try to have somebody who has credibility from the beginning. Okay, and credibility before the mission starts comes mostly from experience in similar environments and age, being among the eldest people. And actually, at the well, I would not say the chance, but the opportunity to experience with the negative sides of it. Because when I became station leader of Concordia, I was 27. I was one of the youngest people in the crew. There were, for instance, 3 people above 50. And at least one person was a bit skeptical that what they saw as a kid, I would be able to lead them in an extreme environment. And in our case, it ended up, it was sorted out and the things went nicely. But I know that there are other young leaders who had a lot of issues just because of their age in Antarctic mission, and sometimes it was like a very, very bad year for everybody involved. Just because they didn't have the credit from the beginning, so they had to earn it before they're able to lead the base efficiently. If they manage to do it, it's just like an annoyance, okay, compared to people who are able to do it from the beginning. And if they don't manage to gain people's trust, then it can be catastrophic. So I'm going to switch to a different field. Okay, there are many examples I could have taken, but I try to like very different categories. So the next one is hygiene. When we were in ICS 4, we took about 2 showers of 30 seconds each a week, okay, because we had to spare water. And that is actually often shocking when I tell that to Western Europeans or to North Americans, for instance. But actually, it's a very cultural thing. Like, hygiene standards are very cultural, and there are some cultures in which taking a shower every day is actually something strange. And the good news is that those standards can be stretched to some extent. People can learn to decrease their hygiene standards when they need to. Okay, if we take some extreme cases, in early Antarctic expeditions, people would often wear their clothes until they could not, they could not support them for a month, for instance, and then they would take the shirt out, put it inside out, and put it back and use the other side of it. And like this, there are some people who spent 4 months with 2 t-shirts. You know, one month on this side, 1 month on the other side, and same with the second t-shirt. That means there are some accounts also of early Arctic and Antarctic expedition where people had to scrape out the grease and the dirt from the skin on their clothes with a knife, because you just could not take it out with water, and because you had too little water, because you had to spare fuel that you needed to melt the snow to get water. On a slightly lesser extreme case, there were some accounts of an admiral in early Antarctic bases who was cleaning 1/3 of his body every day. So in 3 days, he would go through a full cycle. And some of these men were doing something which is called dry cleaning, which consists in taking a shirt or a piece of clothing and you wear it until you cannot stand it anymore. Okay, then you put it aside, you take a fresher one, put it on, and then you wear it for even longer. And then after that, you take it out and you take the first one again, which by comparison feels clean. And like this, you can go through several cycles, and that's called dry cleaning. I don't recommend that. Anyway, my point is not that this should be the standard for space expeditions, of course, but it's quite comforting to know that it can be stretched to such extent and that people were still able to work at a high level of performance. And the less extreme, like a more realistic compromise could be to have a sponge bath on a daily basis. So taking a piece of clothing and just cleaning yourself like that. And that's actually very sustainable. You can have very good hygienic conditions by doing this every day. So showers are not absolutely needed, but I think they should not be discarded right away because they actually have a very positive impact on the mood of some people. They actually had an experience of that in ICS 4 where we had an issue with our water system, and for several days we did not have access to our normal clean water. Fortunately, we had a container outside which had some like emergency water, but it had been sitting in the sun for years before that, so all kinds of things had been growing, reproducing, and dying there. So to be able to use it, we built a distillator with using a food box in which we put a heating plate, and we were like this heating water and then getting the condensate. It worked well, but it was a very slow process, so we had to limit water to its most important uses, drinking, for instance. And some people actually were supposed to have a shower that day, the day when it started, and they had been looking forward to it. And the fact that they could not take it was actually had a big impact on their mood. And it might seem a bit, ridiculous if you see it now, but like in an environment where you have very little pleasures, this can be one of your greatest, one of the things you're looking forward to. So of course it depends on how you produce your water. It depends on how if you're able to extract it on site, how much energy it costs, how efficiently you can recycle it, and so on. But I think that shower should not be taken out completely, if possible. Okay, it's always a compromise between resource use and that. But I think that should not be taken out without further consideration. Now that is for people who want to get cleaner, okay? But another kind of problem is people that, other people would want them to clean more, okay? Because when you have nobody to impress and you don't see clients, you don't have job interviews, some people might let themselves a bit go. Actually, it's quite common in Antarctica for people to get a bit wild. And you get used to your new state, okay, like so this becomes a new normal, and then you tend to sleep even more, and then people can actually go quite far there. And it's actually quite common in Antarctic expeditions, not mine fortunately, but it's actually quite common that somebody gets like so dirty, so smelly that it becomes offensive to the crew members. And the other crew members might not want to say something because they don't want to offend them until the day they explode, and can create very big conflicts. And I think in that case, the station leader should make an intervention, ask the people to ask the person to do something about it. And it sounds obvious, but it's actually not. It's not always the case. Sometimes the station leader does not want to say anything because they're afraid of insulting the person, and they will just, let it stay that way. And one thing that could be done to help the leader is to actually talk about that beforehand, because like this when it happened, when session zero is like, okay, now you need to take a shower, the person does not take it personally because it's something that was agreed on beforehand. Okay, I'm going to switch to a different topic, food. Food obviously is very important in communities, and I'm going to start by showing two different kinds of food systems, the one we had in Hawaii and the one we had in Antarctica. So that's the kind of food we had in Hawaii, because it was, again, designed to be similar to a Mars base, so you had only shelf-stable food. Here you have like dehydrated carrots, dried broccolis, dried cherries, cubes of dehydrated chicken, so mostly dried food. We also had egg powder, milk powder, cream powder, things like that. We also had a little bit of canned food, but very little. And the way it worked is that every day, one person was responsible for food, every day of the week, and the seventh day was for leftovers. And I don't know if it looks very appetizing like this. But to be honest, it depended on the day of the week, depending on who was cooking. But with a little bit of creativity, you could actually have decent meals. You could, for instance, that's what we did for Thanksgiving, take some cubes of dehydrated turkey, hydrate them, put them together, and get a roasted turkey. Okay. And obviously we had the problem that people always have when they're having chicken or turkey with more than 3 people, that there are always too many people who want a leg. All right, and that's a problem which was solved there. And for some reason, my crewmates were only moderately excited about it. I thought it was a great idea. Yeah, another example of mishap is when I made a quiche. Okay, quiche is basically a savory pie. And to make the quiche, I needed to have like dehydrated ham, dehydrated cheese, powdered cream, and so on. And so I had to calculate, okay, for this amount of cheese, I need this amount of water, and so on. And then, okay, so the total amount of water I needed, oh, what? Yeah, okay, yeah. So what I was thinking, okay, yeah, I need this. I made a mistake. And basically the quiche, after 3 times the time it was supposed to cook, and that people being starving to death and plotting against me, I had to take it out of the water, and it was still liquid. Okay, I tried to sell it as a luich, a more liquid version of the quiche, but they did not buy it. Okay. And actually the second time I tried to make a quiche, because I tried again, my pride forced me to do so. And instead of putting sour cream, I used sugar. And the thing is, they look exactly the same, right? Because it was powdered. It was the sour cream was powdered. Okay, so then I had a sweet quiche, which was very hard to justify. And actually, the third time I made a quiche, that when I took it out of the oven, the others had already made pasta. But yeah, I'm getting off tracks. So mostly dehydrated food. We also had a little bit of fresh food because we had brought with us some microbes, lyophilized microbes, and we use them to turn powdered milk and flour into cheese, bread, and yeah, other fermented products. And we also had a little bit of fresh food that we're growing on site with what we could find. Okay, that's for instance a lettuce growing in a hydroponic system made from an old bottle. But to be honest, the amounts were quite small. Okay, that's for instance is our first harvest of cherry tomatoes. It was not exactly filling, but it was actually nice because first the fact of growing food, the activity of growing food has a very good impact on some people. It's actually sometimes done in hospitals because different studies show that people who were in a psychologically difficult situation benefit a lot from tending a garden. And then eating fresh food, even though a little bit after months of dehydrated food, was actually much appreciated, especially given that we made a special event out of it. We called it Le Grand Jour de la Tomate. Americans could not pronounce it was hilarious. And yeah, we put our nicest clothes and we made a special opportunity out of it. So those little ridiculous cherry tomatoes actually had a good mood boosting effect. Now a very different system is that the one we had in Antarctica. There, the food was very different because the temperature outside are never positive, so it's basically a giant freezer and you can just put things in containers and they will stay frozen all year round. Okay. And in addition, we had a cook, okay, which was very nice because in Hawaii, when somebody was cooking on a given day, they often went to bed very late because they had to catch up on the work they didn't do when they were cooking. So it was very heavy on people's schedule. But having a cook was great because you could just come and set the table and you could eat. Usually very, very good food. But where it gets interesting is that people still volunteer to cook. Okay, for instance, for special occasions, that was for Oktoberfest, somebody cooking German food. Or during birthdays, or during holidays, and during the weekend also, people actually enjoyed cooking. And that illustrates nicely what is becoming a consensus is that it's great to have ready-to-eat food so that it's not heavy on people's schedule, but it's also good to give people the opportunity to cook when they have time and feel like it. Because that again is very good for crew mood. Now, another aspect of food is the social aspect of it, eating together. In Hawaii, everybody was having lunch when they had time, but everybody was dinner together. Okay. In Concordia, I insisted that everybody has lunch and dinner together every day. And I was very strict about it. If somebody was not coming, I would actually go and get them and ask them why they were not coming. And one of the reasons was for crew cohesion. Because since everybody had very different jobs, everybody had different personal objectives, that was one of the only moments when everybody, not every day, but on some days it was the only moments when everybody would interact in an informal way. And the other reason why I was strict about it is because food is very important Zeitgeber. Okay, if you have never heard that word, that's fine because I'm going to explain it in the context of sleep. Sleep obviously is critical to performance. If you want your astronauts to have the good cognitive abilities, to have good physical abilities, not to make too many mistakes, you should allow them to sleep properly. That's common sense, especially for long-term missions. Short-term you can do, but long-term missions, you will have serious impact on performance if people don't get proper sleep. Now, it is quite tricky in this kind of environment. Okay, first because you can have people who are very close and making noise and so on. It can be difficult also to sleep properly when you have spent the whole day indoors. Okay, it can be difficult also if you have a lower oxygen level, but possibly more importantly, it's very difficult if you don't have Zeitgebers. And Zeitgebers are basically cues for your circadian cycle to know what time it is. Okay, the most obvious one maybe is light. Okay, if you go outside, if there is a lot of sun, your body knows it's around noon. As light goes down, you know that you're going towards evening. If it's dark, it's night. Okay, your body senses that and kind of adjusts your circadian clock based on that. Now, an interesting thing is that if you don't have zeitgebers, imagine you have no zeitgeber at all, you will still go through a cycle. Of course, you will get tired at some point and you will have a circadian cycle, but it will not, in most cases, be exactly 24 hours. Okay, it depends, it changes from person to person, but the average seems to be around 25.4 hours. And you might think, okay, it's not a problem. You can let people free cycle. Get up when they wake up and then go to sleep when they're sleepy. But the problem is that this, it's called free cycling, actually has been shown to decrease your abilities to cope with this kind of environments. And it is obviously not good for group cohesion. Okay, because if people live in different cycles, it's very difficult to organize group activities. And one thing with space missions that you can have actually weird day-night cycles. Okay, it's obvious on the space station, where you have 90-minute cycles. If you have a mission to Mars, depending on the technology, you can have different cycles. For instance, if the ship is rotating, to expose a different side of the ship to the sun to avoid overheating. On Mars, it should not be an issue because the days are just a little bit longer than on Earth, but on the Moon, we can have days and nights which are almost a month long, and that is something to take into consideration as well. Because day and night, the day-night cycles are one of the most important zeitgebers. And one interesting place to study that is, the poles. Okay. This is a view from my window at Concordia, and I don't know at what time I took it, but it's irrelevant because it would have looked the same at any time in summer. And that was very difficult actually for people to. It was difficult for people to sleep there. When I arrived in the first few days, I slept very little, okay, because I had a lot to do and I was a bit excited, and yeah, so I didn't sleep much the first few days. And whatever time of the day or night I was getting up, I could always find people around in the base. So people called themselves the 3 a.m. club because they just could not see if they would get up and fight each other during the night. And this was solved for some people very quickly. Some people suffered from it only during summer, but some people had this issue during the whole year. Because after the 24-hour daylight, then you go into the winter where it's night most of the time, including 3 months where you don't see the sun at all for 3 months. And that also is a big issue for sleep. And another advantage of Concordia for studying sleep is that you have hypoxia, you have a low level of oxygen, which creates a lot of sleep disturbances as well. So I'm going to give you some of the, let's say, things that we learn in this kind of environment about sleep. I'm not going to give you, of course, all the common advice, like don't exercise just before bed and so on, because they are very well known. But one of the more specific advice is to provide zeitgebers. One way of doing that could be to change the lighting in the habitat based on the time of day you want it to be. Like put more light around the middle of the day, less light at night, and so on. You could also have a fixed wake-up time. You could have a fixed bedtime. You could have a fixed work schedule, fixed meal time as well. Said meals are an important zeitgeber. But providing zeitgeber will be critical. Okay, if you don't have a normal light day and night cycle. Another thing that has proved to be important is investing in high-quality sleep quarters, and it sounds like common sense, but it's been neglected in many expeditions because people try to optimize volume and weight. Okay, it can be okay again for a short mission, but in Hawaii, for instance, we had those little bedrooms, and the sound insulation was very bad. Okay, just by listening, I could always know where people were and what they were doing. And for some people, it was very difficult to sleep in those conditions, and it had a big impact on their performances. And the third point, there are many things I could mention, but I'm going to limit myself to 3: avoiding shifts. Okay, shifts have been the normal way to do exploration in the past. You always wanted part of the crew to be awake at all times in case there was an emergency. It made sense at the time for safety. But there are lots of drawbacks of that. First, some people will, it will be hard to provide Zeitgebers because, well, somebody's noon will be somebody else's midnight. It will be very, some people will be awake when they're sleeping, so that might noise and prevent them from sleeping properly. It's hard also to, it's hard on crew cohesion because it's hard to bond with somebody who's sleeping when you're awake, who's having an after-work drink when you're having breakfast. And so on. And actually, think shifts are less and less necessary because now you have alarms on all the critical systems. Okay, hopefully the alarms on future space missions will be more reliable than even humans. And that's the choice we made in Concordia. Even though some systems were critical for survival, we did not take shifts. Everybody was sleeping at about the same time because we had an alarm system that was ringing in our bedrooms. So sometimes in the middle of the night, you would be awakened by a crazy noise. And I would listen, I would hear like a door slamming open and some quick footsteps, and I would know it was a technician in underwear running to the source of the problem. Okay? And even though they were awakened in the middle of sleep, they were still able to act very, very quickly. Okay, there are obviously a lot of different fields from which, in which you can learn from life in extreme environments, but I'm going to stop here. Again, that was not exhaustive course on what we learned from life in extreme environments, but I hope that now you have a general understanding and background of how and why we look at people in extreme environments on Earth to prepare for future space exploration missions. Thanks for your attention.